This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. This week, we continue with our series, Continuity and Change in the Old Testament. We are now at video 8 on Joshua and Judges. And last time, we covered the theology of the book of Deuteronomy, which was written much later than the events it described. And now we begin what is called the Deuteronomistic history. And the reason we call that is because it seems to be using the theology of Deuteronomy that we covered last time to understand the history of the people of Israel. And it begins with the book of Joshua, where in the book of Joshua, if you know it, is where they enter into the land. And it goes all the way to the end of 2 Kings, which is where they exit the land. And so this history goes through several books, and it really is trying to explain how come this happened. God promised that this land would be for us. We see the way in which they enter the land, and yet if this land was given for them, how come they had to leave? And it's seen primarily as a tragedy. Something went utterly wrong from the start, and even at the very beginning, you see the breadcrumbs that are going to lead toward why this whole thing fell apart. This video will just be about Joshua and Judges when they're first in the land. Later videos will be talking about how this Deuteronomistic history sees what's happening. And what's for us interesting is the way in which this is expressing a very different kind of religiosity than has been to this point thus far. So the first is to understand who enters the land. Remember back in Abraham, we had a family structure. Then in the book of Exodus, we have the structure of an enslaved group that is somehow a people, and then later they become a society in the wilderness. And now when they enter the land, it's not really just a society. A society is how do you live together. This is what we would call a people group. They are not we're going to find out, really a nation yet. They're a people group. And we actually know that from a different source. The first source we have of any type that mentions Israel is the Maranatha Stele, which is from this time period that does mention Israel amongst other peoples around there, but the word used is as a people group, not a nation. And we're going to see why. So this people group is not really one nation. Even after they enter into the land and they lay conquest to it and establish themselves, because they never really were structured. They do have a central unit, but the central unit is the worship center, where you have the Ark of the Covenant, tabernacle. This is what organizes this group, and how the people are actually organized is not as citizens of a nation, but as 12 tribes. And these 12 independent tribes really don't have a lot in common with one another, excepting that they all come to this central space to worship. So the worship center is really what structures them as a people group. And so in the book of Joshua and the book of Judges, the leader of the community, which called a judge. Joshua really is kind of a judge, even though he's not called that, but the very structure of who this is. You have this judge who organizes everyone around this worship center. The judge is going to be very closely associated with the Ark of the Covenant because, after all, the judge is a worship leader, but a specific kind of worship leader, one who becomes a political leader. And where they want a political leadership is not in order to form a government. They have no interest in that. They have no centralized nation. How could they have a centralized government? It is for their military needs. When they are under threat or when they need to engage and interact in some kind of military conquest, there they look to a leader who can organize them. And what really organizes them is somewhat the judge and somewhat the ark. And in fact, in battle, they would take the Ark of the Covenant with them, ahead of them, in order to go fight whoever it was that was around. And why did they do that? Because, of course, that's what organized them together. So what you have is a very loose association of people who are organized around centralized worship, but are not really what we would call in any way a united community. That's going to become an issue later on. And now we have the Deuteronomistic history interpreting this. And it's going to do it with a particular kind of theology. In the book of Deuteronomy, we emphasized one big difference between Deuteronomy and Exodus when they look at the Sinai event, where they get the Ten Commandments, are those blessings and those curses. And it's structured around the idea that God interacts with the people. And I'm just going to use the term Israel, even though it's a little bit anachronistic at the start, but it becomes what the people will be called. And that God interacts with this community, but not vaguely. Interacts through Torah, through what was received at Sinai. And Torah is not just a bunch of laws, it is how God interacts with Israel and how Israel responds to God. It's both things. And of course, Torah does have instruction in it. The really core meaning of Torah is instruction. Well, what can happen then is you can obey the Torah, and if you do that, then there will be success. After all, remember, blessings follow if you follow Torah. But if you do not, if you disobey, then there will be failure. Remember, curses are what comes if you do not obey or disobey. And these are not vague. They are then inflicted upon Israel. So that, how did this look? Well, it wasn't even vague. And what was the blessing? What were the curses? It was all structured around the land. If they're following Torah, if they're following the instruction God gives them, then they will have success as compared to the other people in the land militarily, and they will politically gain the land. If they do not do that, if they disobey Torah, they fail to follow it, then the failure will also come up with the land and they're going to start losing it. Remember, I called this a tragedy. They're trying to understand how come we were kicked out of this land. How come what God promised us hasn't seemingly stuck? Well, this is one way they've described it. Some of you would look at this and say, I don't like this. This sounds like prosperation theology. That is, how do we prosper? Why do we suffer? And you may not appreciate it, but we can appreciate the question. Why? Why is this happening to us? And so for them, the question of whether they're going to prosper or they're going to suffer is a religious question. It's saying, if we are prospering, something must be going right. If we're not, something must be going wrong. There's a very straightforward way of understanding the world in that structure. But it also leads to the challenges they're going to face, because they were faced with the reality that they were offered this space, that they could come into this land, and it was supposed to be theirs, but there were all these other people. Now, the book of Joshua makes it sound like they drive everybody else out, and then if you turn the page to Judges, it makes very clear they did not. There were all these other people always there. It was never just their own space. And so what ends up happening? Well, what you end up with is, in this theology, if you're holding this theology, it is fundamentally fluid. There is never continuity, because as soon as you start disobeying, things go poorly. As soon as you start obeying, things go well, and there's nothing that's going to stop any of that from happening. So when you get to the book of Judges, which is a wild book with things going on that is too complicated for us to look at it now, which is, it always starts in a cyclical way. There's a whole bunch of judges, and the cycle just goes on and on again and again. So it begins with always disobedience. The people are not following Torah, which, of course, following Deuteronomistic theology means they politically fail. They're suffering. And so the people see, hey, we're politically failing, we're suffering. This must be a religious problem. So they repent. And they repent to God, and now they are obeying Torah. They're repenting to God, so God raises up a judge for them. Remember, they have no way of doing this themselves, and the judge is this worship leader who's able to organize these people together. And remember, then that leads toward, and the judge will lead them toward obedience, and the obedience looks like military success. So these judges were military leaders who could organize these 12 tribes together. They would be obedient to Torah, which led to political success. Because again, there's the fluidity of this process of now they're obeying Torah, so they have political success. And then eventually the judge dies. And because there's no continuity at all, what would happen eventually? Well, they'll start disobeying again. So this cycle just goes on and on and on. And so what you end up with is, this is where, is there any kind of stability? Can there be? Are we doomed to be in this level of, it's kind of chaos? It's not in the sense that we know why it's happening, but in real time it seems like chaos. And so they really are struggling. And when you get to the point of the judges, it doesn't really work. They keep on seeking something hereditary because they don't like this. If the judge dies, we need to replace the judge. But we can't replace the judge. It's God who lifts up this judge. And politically, they have no way of doing it because they are such a disparate group. It's that personality which pulled them all together and who was worshiping in the ark. And so they keep on trying to do this. So, for example, having, say, Samuel, who's the last judge, have his sons become the next judges. And it doesn't work. Not only are they not helpful and not righteous, they bring the ark into battle and they lose, and the ark is stolen from them because they are not religiously in the right place. So what you end up with in this book of Joshua and Judges, right from the start, as soon as they enter into this land, they have a significant problem. They're going to find out that this isn't working, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And they're going to try to solve it in different ways. But this is setting it up because they are trying to act like a group of people that aren't very united with one another, but trying to explain it. And so they set up this relatively complicated thing to face the reality that things aren't really going well, and eventually face the reality that they're driven out of this land that God had promised them. We will look at more of that next time with the rise of a king. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.